I'm Shamina Singh, and I'm the founder and president of the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, which is an organization that we set up at MasterCard in order to really aggregate the assets of the company for social impact. So it's an exciting remit if you think about pulling together the capital, the people, the technology, the network, and the products and services of a company that is in over 200 markets connecting millions of people around the world. So it's an exciting prospect. Africa, of course, is a place that we think long and hard about. You've got some really talented speakers here today to talk to you about it. But as we think about this idea of leapfrogging and digitization and lions and all of these other things, you're going to hear from Bhaskar about the research behind it. But for me, it's really about the people behind it. And so as I think about the continent and think about the work that I've seen and the people I've met on this journey, I think about the lions and the leapfroggers that are actually in this room today. And I hope that behind the research, you realize that we're actually talking about you, because you are the people who are taking this continent forward. So if you do nothing else today, I hope that you connect with each other, because together we're all much stronger.
So as part of what the Center stands for and what the Center focuses on is really around research and insights, and that's the reason you're all here today. But in essence, we try to partner with leading economists and scholars to deliver and drive insights that shape the future of inclusive growth, that enable stakeholders from private sector, public sector, and the social sphere to make better decisions about the work that they're doing in the communities that they're serving. In this vein, I'd like to introduce Bhaskar Chakravarti, the Dean of Global Business at Fletcher School of Tufts University, who's going to tell us a little bit about the brand new piece of research we're launching today, the African Leapfrog Index. Bhaskar?
We're talking about lions, and lions, unlike all of you who seem to have stayed up all night and come directly to this room, happen to be creatures that love to sleep. They tend to sleep about 20 hours a day. So why would we expect lions to be on the move? Because they generally don't want to move a whole lot. And for the last several decades, there has been there's this clamor for lions being on the move. And then this, of course, refers to a report from McKinsey, which then McKinsey redid and called it Lions on the Move Part 2. My objective here is to have a conversation about how we can get that lion to leapfrog. It turns out the lions can actually leap quite a bit. And quite surprisingly, when they do move, they can cross some pretty substantial distances. And that is something that I would like to sort of shine a light on in terms of trying to understand how the continent as a whole is poised for that leap, and where we can take some action as policymakers, as investors, as business executives, as strategists to help enable that. So in order to do that, we created something called the African Leapfrog Index, or ALI for short. And the idea here is to, first of all, reflect on some fundamental contextual elements of Africa, which is, of course, old news. This is a continent with enormous potential. This is one of the youngest regions in the world. This is a region that is technologically enabled, with a mobile phone now showing up in virtually every hand. This is a region that's rapidly industrializing, has an entrepreneurial culture, and is at the threshold of growth. So if you bring all these elements together, one should expect an element of almost revolutionary proportions. And so what we are trying to understand is, can the penetration of the mobile phone and all the magic that kind of goes with it help close the gap in terms of bringing Africa, the continent, and individual societies within Africa, bring them up the socioeconomic curve in a way that's accelerated? Can it do it in a way that is inclusive of all layers of society? how does this transformation then tie into a larger Pan-African transformation that is happening as we speak, specifically the Free Trade Zone agreement that has been recently signed? And specifically, what does it mean for each one of us who care about this region, who are invested in this region in all kinds of ways? In order to answer these questions, we created something called the Africa Leapfrog Index. And essentially, this is a measure of where individual countries in Africa are relative to a benchmark that we have created. And very briefly, I will give you the idea of how we came upon that, determined that benchmark. This is an index that comprises three elements that we believe are enormously important in order to understand how digital technology can be transformational. Element number one is, how does digital technology help create jobs? Because jobs are ultimately the pathway to socioeconomic growth. Second is, what is the resilience of the fundamental infrastructure and the governance system in a country to facilitate that? And when I talk about infrastructure, I'm not just talking about the digital infrastructure, but all the other adjacent infrastructure that is essential for operating the digital system, such as power supply and a variety of other elements that are enormously important. And third is, what is the fundamental digital potential of the country? And the fundamental digital potential comprises a number of different elements, which includes where the country is in its evolution from a physical past to a digital future, how quickly it's moving, and what is its propensity to use digital payments as a mechanism for payments or transferring money whenever there is a transaction that's needed. Behind this already messy picture is an even larger mess, which I'm sparing you from. There are about 250 different variables that have been packed into the sausage-making machine. And at the other end of it is an index that I'd like to share with you. And the idea of this index is to take an enormous amount of complexity and bring it down to a level of simplicity so that we can all look at it collectively and figure out where are the strengths to be leveraged and where are the opportunities for us to be able to close gaps and thereby set priorities as stakeholders in a particular country or in a particular region or at the continent as a whole. Okay? So very quickly, what we did was we picked 6 countries that are not only representative of different archetypes of countries across the continent, they also represent different regions, and they are in many ways some of the key drivers of growth across the region, and can both by themselves and in collaboration with their peers drive the continent forward. Now, in order to set a benchmark, what we did was we created a benchmark, not from outside Africa, but within Africa. And what we did was across those 250 different indicators, we looked for what was the best performing country in that indicator, and we put it into a gigantic table, okay? So once you do all of that, you end up with a mythical country that is the best practice country on the continent. And we call this country Leapfrogistan. And the idea here is that this is a benchmark that can be reached because one country in the continent has actually done it. So we just use that as a starting point. We can set any benchmark you want. You can pick a single country as your benchmark. You can take an external benchmark like Switzerland, or you could take the emerging markets benchmark, any benchmark you want. I just decided to pick Leapfrogistan as a benchmark for our discussion this morning. So imagine that outer boundary of that funny-shaped figure as the nirvana. Okay? Now what I'm going to do is flash for you where the 6 countries that I have named, what their footprint is in that space. So Ethiopia, Nigeria, Egypt, Rwanda, Kenya, South Africa. Now, you will see that the whole idea of this index is not to put each one of the countries on some sort of a linear scale, but identify a number of different dimensions that are important for us to consider as drivers, as catalysts for that leapfrogging. And the different countries perform differentially as we look across these different drivers. So I know this now looks like an even bigger mess than we had started, but now let me kind of break this down a little bit, okay? And let's go country by country. And I promise I will not take long, and we can come back to tons of questions that I'm sure this will kick off.
Hello and welcome to the special CNBC Africa broadcast. I'm Nozi Pumbanjwa. We're bringing you a conversation on unlocking digital technologies. Now, if we look at the context and we look at the African context in particular, the rise of e-commerce, the rise of entrepreneurship, the rise of digital adoption, we know that all of these trends can give the continent an unprecedented opportunity for inclusive growth. In addition to that, if we look at the fast-growing population, a more robust workforce, we do realize that when we add an investment in digital infrastructure, that we really could be seeing real digital inclusion on the continent. And earlier this morning, on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum on Africa, the African Leapfrog Index was launched, and we're going to be bringing some of the outcomes of that conversation into this particular conversation this morning. So, ladies and gentlemen, bringing in their voices, bringing in their insights, and bringing in the contributions that they're lifting from the field, and bring these into the conversation on the panel. I'm joined by Professor Bhaskar Chakravorty. He is the Dean of Global Business at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and this is also the expert that has launched this morning the Leapfrog Index on Africa, and he's going to be talking to us a little bit about that. Sitting right next to him, we're joined by Wambui Kinya. She's the Vice President for Success at Andela. Now, that's a really fantastic title, and she's going to be telling us a little bit more about what that means and what they're doing for young people on the African continent. Next to Wambui, we're joined by Tunde Fafunwa. He's a lead advisor to the Economic Commission for Africa, the ECA, and in particular to the Digital Center for Excellence. So we're going to be finding out how this particular center is pushing for the digital agenda across the continent. And last but certainly not least, we're joined by Raghav Prasad. He is the Division President for Sub-Saharan Africa at MasterCard. Thank you very much for making the time to join us. So let me start right at the end with Prof. Chakravorty. Prof, you've just launched earlier today the Leapfrog Index on Africa, the ALI. Talk to us a little bit at a very high level, the key findings that have come out of that.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's a real privilege to be sitting here with some wonderful colleagues who care about Africa and the socioeconomic development of Africa the way everyone here does. The idea of the Africa Leapfrog Index was to follow up on the long delayed promise, I would say, of applying technology, and particularly mobile digital technology, to accelerating the pathway to socioeconomic development for Africa. The idea is not that we can expect this technology to be a magic wand that will transform the continent into an advanced region, but it is potentially a force multiplier that can help accelerate the path to development. The second aspect of our question was to make sure that this acceleration happens in a way that is equitable. That lifts not just a small segment of the society, but brings along the majority of the population. And the third is to be able to leverage some of the transformations that are happening across the continent, in particular, the agreement to have a free trade zone, which has the potential of creating the largest free trade zone in the world. So the idea was to use an evidence-based approach to identifying how different countries in Africa are poised to take advantage of this technological platform and meet their socioeconomic development goals.
And so at a high level, you've looked at different countries, and I think the next question really is looking at the extent to which digital inclusion then becomes a reality, because one would assume that the countries have performed differently on the index, hence the ranking. The countries that stand out as first movers, that have really are moving rapidly towards digital inclusion, what are they getting right that the other countries need to be looking at?
Absolutely, great question. So one of the aspects of digital transformation as a catalyst for growth is that it is very much of a democratizing force. Unlike our historical approaches to development, where you put up a dam and then you have some hydroelectric power that flows, into the rest of the population, and it's primarily a top-down effort, the access to a mobile phone becomes a mechanism for individuals in society to launch ventures, to become entrepreneurs, or to set up a small business. On the other side of the coin, they need to get paid in a simple, secure way. And the payments also can be enabled over that digital system. So the very fact that we are thinking about a platform that is democratic, for it to be successful, it needs to be inclusive, because it needs to be able to embrace as many entrepreneurs as possible. And for each of those entrepreneurs, they need to have access to a market. And that market also needs to be kind of embraced by this technology.
So, Raghav, we hear the passion with which Prof speaks about making sure that digital inclusion is a reality. But if we begin to look broadly at the African landscape, are we seeing this translating as a priority? Are we seeing digital inclusion coming through in national development plans, in sectoral plans, in industry-level plans? What are you seeing on the ground?
Well, as we go around Africa meeting with governments and our partners and stakeholders in the ecosystem, we're starting to see the direction of travel is very clear. As Prof talked about it, when I'm out meeting, whether it's the government of Rwanda, whether it's I'm traveling in Nigeria or in Ethiopia or Kenya, the conversation is about how do we short-circuit the evolutionary curve of the market, right? All markets in Africa are moving in the direction of pretty significant economic growth.
Right.
Africa's had from 2000 to 2015, 16, about 4.5% GDP growth annually. Right. 4 out of the 5 fastest growing economies in the world are currently in Africa. Right. The fastest rate of urbanization is in Africa at the moment. We'll have 1.1 billion young, new, technologically savvy workers in Africa in the next 15 years, right? So all the various ingredients for growth are coming together.
Right.
The question now is, how can you apply a force multiplier to that? How can you make it happen faster? How can you make that the time that it would take, 15, 20, 30 years that it would normally take to evolve, how can we compress that? And we're starting to see digital and the digitization of the economy actually drive that at a much faster pace, right? Let me illustrate that with an example. If you think about what's the backbone of the economies of Africa, it's the micro SMEs.
Right.
Right? The small dukas, the small mom and pop shops, right? They employ a vast majority of the people. They generate about 40% of the GDP. What stops these small businesses from growing is access to credit, right? And the problem they have such a large issue with access to credit is because their transactions are usually in cash. So there's no record of what they've bought, what they've sold, what stocks they've picked up. And so a financial institution finds it difficult to take risk on it. MasterCard actually launched a product from our labs for financial inclusion in Kenya, where we've currently got 40,000 of these SMEs on a platform, and we're digitizing their buying and selling activities. And on the basis of that, we've got banks that are actually lending working capital to them. I met one of these dukas very recently. In the last 18 months, their turnover has trebled.
Sure.
Right? Because they've got access to credit. And that is the kind of multiplier, that's the kind of short-circuiting of the evolutionary curve that I think digitization will drive.
So I want to stay a little bit with the micro businesses, the mom and pop shops that you've spoken about, and I want to come to you on this particular question, because if we look at the nature of the African economy, for the most part, about 86%, I think, is the number of all employment in African markets actually comes from what is generally the informal market. So let's bring digital technologies into that space. And I'd love for you to firstly just give us a high level on the focus of Andela, and then more importantly, as a secondary to that, how do you see digital technologies playing in the informal sector and the extent to which that they can support the micro businesses that Raghav was talking about?
Sure, thank you, and good morning to everyone. So Andela is a technology company, a technology services company. We have a network of about 1,800 software engineers that sit in about 6 countries in Africa. It was founded on the premise that brilliance is evenly distributed. So what does that mean? In this continent where we continue to talk about the opportunity for this demographic dividend, this investment in youth, and how we enable and empower digital technologies, skills is an important part of this. And in as much as we talk about technology, the one area that has not been democratized well has been, on the one hand, we've got this entire chasm, where on the one hand we have employers and companies that are trying to build technology and they're embracing technology and they're unable to find talent. If you just go to any job boards, the jobs that they're seeking are software engineers. And then you've got this continent that has a vast number of very talented young people who have not necessarily had the opportunity to truly identify what are the skills that would be most able to leapfrog that chasm, to sort of use some of the professor's language. And what Andela found was that certainly in Nigeria and Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Egypt, Ghana, are young people who have a passion and a desire to learn. We are venture-backed, and from the likes of, we've raised about 180 million over the course of 5 years, from the likes of Generation, which is Al Gore's firm, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and they've invested in not only the fact that we can identify the talent in Africa, we can bridge and immerse them very directly to the skills that are required in the global marketplace, but that we can do that at scale. So to get from Nigeria to 6 countries in 5 years and to have employed 1,800 is significant. Through partnerships with Google and Facebook, we've extended beyond Andela, because we've identified that the way we think about skills, the way we think about the skills that are required in order for us to fully embrace the digital technology opportunities to leapfrog in Africa is to truly disrupt what it means to actually identify skills. We have about 60,000 learners across 54 countries. They do these 6 to 8 week courses. Yeah. They're able to be exposed and be able to learn as distributed team members, building things, building applications. Tying it to your question around SMEs, the people who are on these communities, we call it the Andela Learning Community, are able to not only identify how those skills are relevant to employment, but also how are those skills relevant to their businesses. Right. We have amazing stories of women who've built applications that allow them to connect to other mothers, and they're able to figure out where is there a good sale, where should we go and buy. These might sound like very simple ways, but this is sort of the way that they're able to be producers of the opportunity versus just simply the consumers of those opportunities, and then to be able to do that at scale. I think where there's still a bit of a gap is in how do we, as in a room full of many practitioners and strategists around these ideas, how do we make it more full circle? I'm excited to see that Harambe is in the room. But again, it's like, what are the skills that are required to make us be able to leapfrog? And how do we disrupt the idea that it has to be education in the traditional sense? And then how do we connect it directly to actual employment?
So you raise an important point that I'm going to park with you, Prof, and then I'll come back to it, the possibility of transitioning from low-skilled to high-skilled jobs, and whether digital technologies can be the conduit that help us to do that. But before I come to you, I'd like to come to Tunde. And again, Tunde, just the Digital Center for Excellence, very high level. How are you supporting the African agenda in terms of moving towards digital inclusion and inclusive growth more broadly? And then I want to come to you around the question around the progress that you're seeing on the ground. But let's start off with the center, very high level.
Sure, thank you. So great to be here. The Digital Center for Excellence at the Economic Commission for Africa has really been set up recognizing the amazing efforts that are being done somewhat in governments, very much on the private sector, and very much on the civil society. So our main tenet is that we think we can be a platform to bring the different sectors together in this area of digital transformation, to be able to achieve some of that leapfrogging that Prof has talked about. Because we have huge challenges across the continent. As many people know, more than 50% of Africans are below the age of 25. The rate of unemployment in the youth is really high. And so we have a challenge. And that challenge, we believe, can be met through digitalization, but only if we work together. And so the Digital Center for Excellence actually provides a platform for policymakers, for the private sector, commercial, and civil society to work together on these specific problems.
Let's stay on that possibility of those partnerships and the collaboration. What are you seeing as successful configurations where the partnership is yielding greater inclusion, and we're seeing that the private sector, the public sector, and maybe even civil society as an additional partner have found a configuration that works? We talk broadly about collaborations and public-private partnerships, but what are you seeing as the right configurations if you're going to make it work?
Yes, great question. So we were involved a couple of months ago in a sort of experimental approach, actually here in South Africa, that identified an area that could potentially provide significant number of jobs for young people, and that happened to be business process outsourcing. And the idea was, how do you go from maybe 50,000 agents or seats or staff across the industry to 200,000 or 500,000 in 5 years? And what was very interesting about this session was that it brought together members of the government and policymakers in trade and industry, commercial and business process outsourcing companies, and Harambee was there as well. Because the only way that you could figure out how you're going to get these massive number of young people employed was to understand what are the underlying conditions, what training do they need. Okay, it's fine. Well, how are they going to get to the centers to be able to do the job, right? So it was a wonderful collaboration around a shared goal that was important to everybody. And we really see that as the kind of model going forward, is identifying these major areas of opportunity, both at the country level and then regionally. We talked about the opportunity of the continental free trade area, and then working on those to sort of start the engine of digital growth or accelerate it.
So that's a beautiful point to remind our live audience. If you're following us on Facebook right now, you can also continue this conversation on social media. The hashtags we're using for today is digital inclusion, as well as hashtag unlocking digital tech. That's digital inclusion as well as unlocking digital tech. We want to take this conversation to the world. And I come back to my panel now because what you've raised, Tunde, is also something that Prof has spoken about, and that is the ability to leapfrog over almost the traditional understanding of how free trade works. And Prof, I want to bring that to you because we know that the continental free trade area has moved from just being an idea on the African continent. We've seen an operational agreement earlier this year coming into play. So we're really beginning to see the cogs turning. What opportunity through digital technologies now could we see that could make the way this trade agreement comes into play significantly different from anything else that we've seen in the world?
Yeah, so great question, and of course the opportunities that a free trade zone presents are both exciting and potentially limitless, because there are a number of different ways in which it could be transformational. Let me just use an example of an enterprise that I talked about in our session. This is an enterprise called Kobo 360.
Right.
And what they do is they're essentially a trucking a company that enables people who need a logistics provider that can move packages from point A to point B, and it matches them with somebody who has a truck. It's like an Uber for trucks. Now, imagine a company like this. It could have a market in a single city where it was started, or it could have a market across multiple cities, but still that market could be relatively small because you're part of a developing world nation. Now imagine that market being expanded not to a city or a cluster of cities or a country, but 50 plus countries. Now we are talking about a gigantic market through all its phases of development. So once you take the borders off, you have a company like Kobo 360 operating out of Nigeria, Ghana, Togo, Kenya, and then soon in multiple countries across the continent. So the access to markets and the relatively easy way in which you could transcend the boundaries using digital technology, because all it takes is the ability to connect onto the app on a mobile phone. And then you can really scale up. You can create jobs across a wide variety of communities. You can move shipments from one part of the continent to the other and really solve a problem that could help not only a company like Kobo 360, which is a logistics provider, but an e-commerce company like Jumia, which is trying to move packages from one part of the continent to another.
So as we create more jobs along the value chain, how do we ensure that we are skilling in from low skills to high skills so that the workforce can actually tap into those opportunities beyond the low-skilled opportunities that we often see? Very quickly to you, Prof.
So I speak as somebody who is an immigrant into the digital planet. I came from the physical planet. For a large part of my life, I was born knowing how to do things physically. And only now I'm learning how to do things digitally. The population that we are talking about, the majority of the population was born on this digital planet. They were born with that phone in their hands. So they start out basically getting a text message, an SMS message, which says, you need to deliver this package from here to there, or move the shipment from a shelf to a truck. So they start out at a very low skill level. Then they realize that they can actually play around with a number of apps on that phone, and one of those apps could give them access to a higher skilled job if they could figure out how to use navigation systems, for instance. They know how to drive, and instantly they move on. The access to the phone gives them ability to get self-educated in a number of different areas. They could develop some technical skills, and before you know it, they could develop website development skills, and they could sign up on an online freelancing platform, and they could become very highly skilled digital workers, all over the course of less than a year. And we've seen that happen, particularly because these are digital natives we're talking about.
So I want to come to the audience very quickly to get their voice in, but you've given us a really high note of optimism in terms of what's possible. I'm going to dampen that a little bit, Raghav, and ask you this question. If we are really radically truthful about the state of access on the African continent, we know that there are substantial access gaps that still exist. In fact, in some markets, even digital payments really haven't taken off or haven't gotten the wide-scale adoption that we are hoping to see. So what needs to be true if true financial inclusion is going to be a reality on the African continent? What needs to change so that we're not fiddling at the periphery, but we're really moving at the scale and the speed that we often speak about?
Well, I'm a digital optimist, so it's difficult for me to dampen my enthusiasm for Africa. But I think fundamentally it comes down to a very simple concept. We can't, Africa, we've always talked about, and everybody's worried about this long last mile. How do you actually connect? And how do you actually scale? The beauty of digital is that the long last mile is literally an electron. It is the device in your hand. It's the connected device that you're dealing with. The spread of digital mobile internet starting to really reach out in Africa. The prices will eventually come down. Devices, whether it's smartphones, which are now about 40% of the total population, but the rest still have feature phones. So it really is about coming up with a completely new playbook.
Right.
So if you look at it from the payments world, the playbook that was used in the rest of the world was this $300 terminal and a $3 piece of plastic, right? When you're trying to scale in Africa, that playbook doesn't work, right? The investment that's required for that is just going to be horrendous. The answer, however, is to look at virtual technologies. I'll give you an example. We have been working on and launched last year a quick response code, a QR code-based payments capability, which we launched in Tanzania as a pilot. Over a period of 9 months, between QR and virtual cards connected to mobile wallets, we've enabled 23 million consumers in a matter of 9 months to be able to use digital payments, right? To do, whether they're buying at a small corner shop, whether they're buying their goods, or whether they're paying for pizza, or whether they're paying for fuel, right? That is the lifeblood of the economy.
Yeah.
So it really is about thinking through what's the playbook that we need to use and how do we scale it up quickly and bring the benefits and, as Bhaskar used the word, democratize growth and make it as inclusive as possible.
So plug and play in the African context, plug and play for Africa. So I'm going to open up the conversation and I'm going to invite the audience to ask some questions or share some insights. Kindly please just briefly introduce yourself if you'd like to ask a question. Do we have any questions coming from the floor? Thank you very much. We've got Mr. Amin right here in the front. Please go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, MasterCard and CNBC for organizing this. It's a good discussion, and I'm pleased that Omidyar Network is an investor both in Andela and in the Digital Center of Excellence at UNECA. My question is for the professor. The governance dimension of your framework, I'm wondering how does data protection and privacy factor into that? At least less than half of the countries in Africa currently have data protection regimes or data protection authorities, including those are in draft form as well. So it's still a long way to go. And 3 of the countries that you had fairly high governance rankings don't have DPAs or laws. I'm wondering how is that factored into your framework?
Thank you very much. So let's take maybe 2 more questions from the floor. Thank you very much. There's a microphone just behind you, so voice from Harambee.
My name is Mariana Iskander. I'm the CEO for Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator, and I just had a question, I think, picking up on the 2 points. One on the index, which is our experience is what is happening at the ground level in terms of putting in place all these things, but then young people cannot afford the data to access the fancy apps everybody's creating, the big ideas. And so I'm interested in that dimension particularly, and I think, we're a great admirer of Andela's work is like the experience actually on the ground for young people to be able to actually access all of the opportunity that's there, that's really driven by the high cost of data in so many of these markets.
Thank you very much. So let's take one more just behind me. Please go ahead.
Good morning, and thanks for the great discussion. My name is Debel Chamberlain. I'm the managing director of a think tank based in Cape Town called Senfree, and we're all about using insights to unlock positive economic development on the continent. My question links to Makti's question about governance. I really liked the index and how it allows us to observe strengths and weaknesses. I really like the fact that governance is in there. My question is whether that's kind of analog governance that we're talking about there, about the fair rules and processes to ensure good business in a country. And I'm particularly interested in the governance that is now required to govern continent-wide benefits and to affect decisions on policy and private sector issues that are dramatically taken outside of the continent. And I'm wondering whether your index also reflects on the countries and the continent's readiness to engage at that level, because it's no longer just a jurisdictional discussion.
Sure. Fantastic question. So beyond the national boundaries and looking at the continental opportunity and what governance looks like there. Any other questions before I close this Q&A? Okay, so I've got 2 more questions. I think let's take them because I'm not going to come back again. So let's take a question here. And then, sir, I see you there at the door. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm Claudine Aute, the Regional Director for West Africa for Care International and international NGO. We mostly work with women and girls for their economic, social, and political empowerment. And I'm so amazed to be here hearing about digital inclusion. But yesterday at the WEF, at the plenary session, the Deputy Secretary General of the UN said that the digital technology has brought a new dimension to inequality, the digitally empowered and the digitally deprived. And as we know, most of them are women. Importantly, women in rural areas, those we work with. So how can we ensure, when we talk about inclusion, that they are part, and then they also benefit of all the, what technology can offer, not only as consumers, but also be part of the production, and also take full advantage and be part of decisions that are made in their favor.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So how do we make sure we're not leaving women and girls behind? Sir, please go ahead. Last question. Yes?
I'm Christo Goosen. I'm a Chief Technology Officer in the InsurTech industry. So in the book, The New Geography of Jobs, they state a theory that for every high-tech job, there's 5 auxiliary jobs created. So the problem that I see is there is venture capital, there is opportunity, but the brain drain is a very real factor at the moment. So as soon as a star is seen in Africa, they move over to Europe or to the US or even Asia to work for one of the big tech firms. How do we address keeping the skills here so that we can not only create auxiliary jobs, but also empower others to take up the same skills and empower themselves?
Thank you very much, Krista. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I'm going to come back to the panel and weave the questions that we've received from the audience, a fantastic set of questions. And Tunda, I'll start off with you first. And I'd love for you to take on the question that Krista's just asked, because as he was asking the question, I saw you rapidly writing down notes in response. So raising a very important question starts off with a very optimistic statement. For every one high-tech job, there are 5 auxiliary jobs. But have we missed an opportunity by not focusing on the brain drain? When stars are seen in Africa, they're seen by the rest of the world. Powerful statement from him. How do you respond to that?
Yes, and a great set of questions. The response is with some difficulty, but there are opportunities. So I think what we see is that as we are creating the platforms for entrepreneurs and innovators, and we've heard about some of that from Prof and Cabo 360, the fact that the Continental Free Trade Area is going to provide an enormous market and opportunity, and not just within Africa, but for Africa to trade with the rest of the world. I think we'll start to see the size of opportunities that will make the entrepreneurs and innovators want to stay here in Africa. But it is a global marketplace, and we have to be able to compete for the labor. Of course, Africa is a great place. It's home to the 1.2 billion, and I'm sure there are going to be plenty of opportunities for people to generate that kind of growth here and not just be
Yeah, Wumba, I'd love to have your voice on this question as well, yeah.
Certainly as a practitioner, we can speak to the demand of those skills. So Andela, essentially our business model is we present our technologists, our network of technologists, as software engineers that can work as remote and distributed engineers embedded in teams across the world, primarily with growth companies that are building product and building product fast and in need of software engineers. It's a challenge in terms of, you are right, when they see the stars, they will come. And I think a lot of what Andela has been pushing is the notion that it is okay to contribute, and certainly we contribute to a lot of product companies globally, but still do it as an embedded member and still sit in Lagos, still sit in Kenya. I think we've seen a lot of growth in a lot of remote and distributed tools. And so when you look at the likes of GitHub and Zoom and sort of how they're growing, it is possible to still be a contributing member in the global marketplace and still reside on the continent. And I think a lot of what keeps a lot of Andelans at Andela is the notion that you now also have a network. You are able to learn from others in a way that before required you to go to Berlin, required you to go to Toronto, required you to go to Silicon Valley. But you have a lot more access to Africans that are representing what it means to be a great software engineer. But it is a challenge.
Well, let's stay with you, and maybe if you can pick up the question that came from the CEO of Harambee and the reality that we're coming up with fantastic apps, fantastic inventions and digital technologies, but the reality is the young people that need this the most likely just can't afford it. How were you navigating around that space?
Sure, and a great question. So a lot of what we've had to invest our venture capital raises has been to building the infrastructure. To the earlier question of how might we dampen up all this optimism, I think in as much as we do need to focus on girls, as much as we do have to focus on the last mile, it's also in how are we enabling and making it possible for young people in the areas that have high penetration to be able to be producers within this internet. And access to internet, access to the devices that allow you to build applications is still a large barrier. With Andela, we've invested in building the centers that allow us to have reliable internet and reliable power, because the one thing we don't want is a global marketplace to say Africa was hard. But that's taken quite a bit of investment. The other things that we do try and do through the partnerships on the Andela Learning community is providing stipends, because you can build very good apps using your mobile phone, and we've seen it with 60,000 people in 54 countries where they don't have access to all those devices. So, but being able to provide that stipend is a little bit of the fix, but how we can reduce the cost of being able to access data will be very critical.
Raghav, if I just want to bring the question from Claudina where she's cautioning and saying, do we run the risk of embedding new inequalities or entrenching existing inequalities where the reality has always been women and girls as observers and on the margins of where we're moving as societies? Your thoughts on that, and in particular, how MasterCard is approaching that particular caution of leaving women and girls behind?
Great question. So if you think about Africa and the economy, firstly, a large proportion of the micro SMEs in Africa are women. A vast proportion of people working in the agriculture sector are women. And we're very conscious of the fact that actually we need to operate and digitize at the bottom of the pyramid. That is a particular area of focus for the Center for Inclusive Growth that MasterCard has set up, and the investments we're making in developing new products, new solutions that we're taking to market. I mentioned the capability we've created for micro SMEs in Kenya, which we're piloting at the moment. We've created similar capabilities for farmers that connect farmers directly to agents and to buyers, and the ability to be able to digitize payments and to be able to sell their crops at the best price, and to do it quickly without having to travel for miles and miles and miles to actually sell their produce, which I believe directly affects the populations at the bottom of the pyramid, a large chunk of which are women. If you kind of work up that chain, if you will, or chain of thought, if you will, going back to the conversation we're having about skilled jobs, one of the things that MasterCard does, in fact, globally, not just in Africa, is a program called Girls for Tech, right? We are very firmly behind the idea that women, I'm married 28 years, I know women are smarter than men, right? The women have the opportunity to participate in this technological revolution, in digital inclusion. And we want to encourage women to take that step forward and participate in building digital technologies and becoming digital entrepreneurs, and indeed filling the vast skills gap that exists. The wonderful thing about digital inclusion or digital technologies is You don't need large factories. You don't have to spend millions and millions of dollars to become productive. It's something that can be done across a kitchen table. It can be done, in your small room that you and the family are living at. So it really is a whole bunch of things that we're doing to make sure that we don't create or increase any gender inequality on the digital side.
So very deliberate about making sure that women and girls are not left behind across the business model and across all markets. So, Prof, let me come to you with the final two questions that were raised. The first one is the question of data privacy and data protections, and how you're navigating that particular challenge.
Absolutely. I had a deal with Raghav earlier that if there's a difficult question, he's going to answer it. But given that he's already answered his question, let me just kind of do him a favor by actually building on just the last point on gender, and then I'll get to your question about data privacy. We actually did a study on precisely this question, which is how does the adoption and penetration of digital technology have an impact on gender equality and gender parity. And because the arguments can be made that can go both ways. It gives women access to information and network and resources. At the same time, it could exacerbate the digital divide. What we found was looking across 80 different countries, a 1% increase in digital uptake translates into a 2.2% improvement in a gender parity index that we had created. So happy to give you a link to that work. This was also done in collaboration with the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. So I do believe that there is evidence behind the kind of the broader observations that Raghav just mentioned. On the issue of data privacy, and this is, of course, the question of the day, the question about what are the policies and regulations regarding privacy, confidentiality, security relative to whether it's cybercrime or intrusion by an over-aggressive state or some other authority that could tap into the system. Ultimately, this all sort of comes down to a notion of trust, because these policies and regulations are about building trust in a system that we cannot physically touch or feel or even understand. All we're doing is we're putting our finger on a sheet of glass and we're believing that there's something behind it that makes things happen. This is unlike going into a market and I can pick up a mango, I can smell it, or I can see that the banana is too ripe or not too ripe, and I can interact with the person on the other side of the transaction. Here, the person on the other side of the transaction is invisible. They could be in a different part of the continent. They could be on the other side of the world. So these regulations are enormously important. We know that every part of the world is struggling to get a set of regulations in place. In terms of what we used in order to create the index, we did put in what regulations are already in place and what are the regulations that are in discussion or in development within each government. We have not yet factored in the Pan-African regulations, which are still very much work in process, and there just isn't enough data to be able to factor that into an index. We look forward to doing that as we advance this index in the coming years. So what we have looked at in terms of governance and the resilience of the governments is what are the laws and regulations in place? Are there protections to your data, but also online protections? Because a number of governments around the world, quite often they restrict certain kinds of data on the system, and in a number of governments, the internet is just shut down.
Yeah.
And when it is shut down, if I run a business that relies on this infrastructure, I don't know if I wake up tomorrow morning and this system is shut down. Or if I'm going to put my payments into the system, I don't want to have a blackout that could affect me financially. So we have factored those elements in on a nation-by-nation basis. I do believe that the free trade agreement could be a catalyst for really creating a Pan-African version of GDPR, the system that has taken root in Europe and is beginning to be a model that other regions are using. And we're already seeing several versions of that taking place across the continent, and all of that has been factored in. And I do look forward to creating, getting more data on the Pan-African version of this regulation.
Did you want to just include on that, Raghav?
Just a very quick point. Bhaskar mentioned GDPR. When we're talking to regulators around Africa, wherever there are some that have already set up data regulations, everybody else is looking at them very carefully. But interestingly, we need to make sure that the private sector or players in the market don't wait for those. So MasterCard, for example, has decided that we will drive GDPR regulations and work within GDPR regulations globally, irrespective of whether the regulators on the ground have set up the regulations or not. Because we believe this is great market practice, this is the right way to drive digital inclusion and to make sure that we respect the data and the right of ownership of the consumers of that data, no matter where they are.
And I just want to bring in the final question that came from Senfree, which in a way does flow very much from the response that you've given already. And the question is, if we look at the good governance aspect of what the index surfaced, are we still within national confines in terms of within markets, or is there a possibility to begin to look at continent-wide benefits? Your thoughts on that?
So in terms of what we have factored into the index as it currently stands, we have factored in national policies.
Yeah.
The Pan-African policies are still being developed, so we don't really have that evidence base to draw upon, and we look forward to incorporating that in future versions of this.
Well, we've come to the close of our conversation, but I do want to be a little bit sneaky and just give you one last challenge for the morning. If you look around the room, you'll notice there's a lot of cameras in the room, and so as you would have it, when there's media in the room, we're always looking for one special tagline that we're going to use on the news at 7 p.m. Right? So what we're going to do is that I'm going to ask you to put on your editorial hats and you're going to give us the special tagline that we're going to use on the news. And all I want for you to include somewhere in that tagline is digital inclusion. Right? And let's also remember, you're not delivering the entire story. You're not doing the report. You're literally only getting the tagline that's going to be showing when I'm on screen. Right? And the tagline just has to have the words digital inclusion. So I'm going to start at the far end and give the gentleman the opportunity who spoke really fast this morning. Digital inclusion. Your tagline for the 7 p.m. news.
Digital inclusion is a phrase which I think is redundant because digital translates into democratic access, which translates into inclusion. So you could just say digital and you've already said inclusion.
So we've got a live report coming from the ground, quite a long story they're giving us from Prof, but nonetheless, it's a redundant phrase because digital, by its very nature, I'm going to summarize for you, is inclusive. All right, so digital is inclusive. That's the tagline we're going for on the 7 p.m. news on channel Chakravorty. Right, let's go to Tunde. What is your line? Digital inclusion?
Africa poised for growth through digital inclusion.
Africa poised for growth through digital inclusion. Fantastic tagline. Wambui?
That was quite powerful. I'll be slightly provocative and counter the professor. Digital inclusion. Really? Skills necessary for inclusion.
Fantastic tagline. Digital inclusion, exclamation, question mark. Really? Skills for inclusion. Fantastic. And so, Raghav, you're taking us home at 7 p.m. So what is your tagline?
Digital inclusion will short-circuit the evolutionary curve of Africa's growth.
Ladies and gentlemen, digital inclusion will short-circuit Africa's curve towards digital growth, and that's the best line to leave this particular show on. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. Remember that we'd love for you to continue this conversation. The hashtag is digital inclusion, and we are also can be followed at MasterCard and at CNBC Africa. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. I'm Nozi Pumbanjo.